Okay, traders, now we're going to be discussing confirmation bias and really a lot of different cognitive errors and human biases that ultimately impact and negatively influence your trading performance. Now, confirmation bias is a little bit of an interesting one. It's a difficult one to market because a lot of traders and in fact a lot of human beings don't even know they're influenced by confirmation bias. But I can guarantee that every single trader, every single individual, yourself, myself, we're all influenced by confirmation bias day to day, and we don't even realize it. So it's very important to become aware of what this bias is, how it impacts your way of thinking and making decisions and your emotional state, and specifically for this series, how it negatively impacts your trading and what you can do about it. Okay. Now, if you find this lecture useful, and if you find any of the other previous videos useful, please share them with your trading communities. Let's get this series out there. And if you haven't already, make sure you check out the Trading Psychology Archetype quiz. That quiz is going to share with you which of the 4 trading mindsets you are, and or rather that you have, and it's going to give you a free personalized report and show you exactly how you can master your psychology to start getting consistently paid by the markets. And really everything we talk about on this YouTube channel and on this series in particular is helping you get consistently paid by the markets. And confirmation bias is a big one that you need to master. Okay, let's get into it. Now, part 1 of this masterclass, where does confirmation bias actually come from? What is it? Why is it so important to understand? Okay, we've discussed in previous videos in this series, if you haven't already watched these, make sure you go back and watch them, that you have 2 major components to your brain. You've got more of a human advanced part of your brain, which we can refer to as the prefrontal cortex. You've also got more of a survival part of your brain, which is the more emotional part of your brain, which is the amygdala. And there are multiple components to the limbic or the emotional system, but I'm just going to for simplicity's sake rather, share these 2 ideas. You've got the amygdala, you've got the prefrontal cortex. Your amygdala is more the chimp, the monkey, whatever you want to call it, and the prefrontal cortex is more the human. Everybody has these 2 functions, and you probably experienced both these functions. You probably had situations and reactions in your life where you've reacted like a little bit of an animal. You also probably had more mature reactions where you've reacted like a human being. And day to day, you're probably gonna go back and forth between the 2, and definitely throughout your life, you're gonna alternate between the 2, and you're gonna experience both an animalistic reaction and a human reaction, and that's just part of being a human being. You're gonna have both reactions. Anyway, let's say for example you are, or let's think thousands of years ago from an anthropological perspective. So every human being has been developed through conditioning, through society, from our ancestors. And let's wind back the clocks thousands of years ago. Our ancestors had less of a developed prefrontal cortex, and they had more of a heavily wired amygdala. And the reason why that was the case was because a lot of the times, thousands of years ago, there were significant life-threatening situations. And they didn't have the certain infrastructures we have in society nowadays. They didn't have a supermarket. They didn't have access to clean and hydrating water that wasn't filled with, nasty stuff. They didn't have shelter and security like we do for the most part nowadays. So our ancestors were constantly in those, if we have a look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they were in those lower levels where they were constantly trying to survive day to day. In society, for most people nowadays, a lot of those basic needs are taken care of. So we have the opportunity to function from a higher function, the prefrontal cortex, although not everybody does, but we have the opportunity to do that. So thousands of years ago, if our ancestor was in a life-threatening situation where they perceived threat, actually let's draw this more central, and they were out in the wild and they were faced with what they perceived in that moment as a threat, a challenge, right? Something that could harm them, something that could kill them. In that moment, they would label that thing bad, negative. They would have a perception of that's not a good thing to be faced with. And then the ancestors that survived developed this mechanism where they would accentuate how bad that thing is, all the way to this is an all bad, never good, no positive, all negative situation, as a way to get adrenaline and cortisol up in the body. Now, when they had this reaction, they would have confirmation bias to only let in what is negative in that moment into their brain, into their awareness. And when they would have what is referred to as disconfirmation bias to block out any of the positives or any of the benefits that were trying to access the awareness in that moment as a survival mechanism to get adrenaline and cortisol up and have this be primed for a flight or fight response. So the perception and the biochemistry were intertwined, where because they were labeling this a terrible or negative event because of confirmation bias was only letting in the negatives, and they were blocking out any benefits, it was a way to get them into a primed, sympathetic fight or flight response, and they would have literally a biochemical reaction in the body where there would be an increase in certain chemicals, there'd be a lowering in other chemicals because of this perception, and there would be, all the blood would go to the outskirts of the body, into the muscles, away from the major organs, as a way to be in a situation where they had all the resources in their muscles so they could run or they could fight in that situation. So that was a necessary survival mechanism that our ancestors had to develop and had to have in those life-threatening situations. Now, fast forward to today, we have those same mechanisms hardwired within us. If we're about to get hit by a car, if we're about to get hit by a train, if we're about to get stabbed or attacked, or if we perceive a life-threatening threat in that situation, we have those same mechanisms that fire, and we have adrenaline and cortisol and that same reaction in our body. And we're never going to be able to get rid of that. That's a necessary part of our survival. But the likelihood of us needing that day to day is very, very low nowadays. So as traders, especially if we're sitting at a computer in an air-conditioned apartment with proper risk management, we don't need that survival mechanism in that moment. We don't need the confirmation bias survival mechanism in that moment. Now, I've mentioned in a few of my lectures, the more emotional, or rather the less awareness you have, which means the more narrow your awareness, the more emotional you're going to be. So confirmation bias narrows your awareness as a way to increase emotion and your survivability in that moment, okay? But it also decreases your thrivability, your ability to thrive from the prefrontal cortex. And the more aware you are, meaning the less confirmation bias you have, right? The less emotional you are, and the more your prefrontal cortex is activated, and the more you can actually stick to your processes and your trading plan without making emotional judgments in that moment. Now, fast forward to today, and let's make this a little bit more trading related. If you're sitting at your computer screen, and by the way, let me just also add here, this goes the other way as well. If you're in the wild or if our ancestor was in the wild trying to chase after dinner, and they had a prey, something they perceived as weaker and smaller than them that they could kill and capture, they would have the same mechanism but in the opposite direction. That's an all positive prey that would accentuate how good that is as a way to get that same mechanism firing so they could capture food. And really this confirmation bias, disconfirmation bias mechanism to get adrenaline and cortisol up was all to run away from threat and capture what they perceived as prey so they didn't starve to death, so they could keep themselves alive. Okay? So when we talk about this from the market's perspective, or from our relationship with the market nowadays, if you're in the market and you have just experienced a loss in that moment and you perceive it as a loss, that same survival mechanism can fire, where you have confirmation bias to only let in how negative that is, accentuate it, you get angry, you have adrenaline, cortisol pumping through your body, and you can feel red hot, you can feel angry in that moment. And you also simultaneously have disconfirmation bias to block out any of the benefits, any of the positives in that moment, and that's what's accentuating that reaction. And it's this avoidance from the market. You want to get away from it, it's a threat. And so too, you may take a win in the market, and you may label that a really good experience, and you may have an accentuation of how good that is, and you'll have cortisol and adrenaline pumping in your body as well. And some of those really big wins in your journey, you may struggle to sleep after them. You may struggle to, you may feel really, really elated in those moments. But again, that's just a narrow perspective, because you're with disconfirmation bias blocking out any of the drawbacks, any of the negatives in that moment, which typically you find out the next day or the next week when you go on a losing streak. But this same mechanism is going to fire because we haven't, human nature never gets rid of these old mechanisms. It just builds new layers on top of. And like I've mentioned, these mechanisms are still essential in high life-threatening survival mechanisms. But when we're sitting at the markets and when we're trading, really remember our goal is to be process-based. Our goal is to be in process-based thinking and process-based decision-making, which means that we have to learn how to manage fear and greed, quiet down the emotions, and objectively see the market free of as much bias as possible, and make decisions when the market aligns with our trading plan. We then make a decision to execute in the markets. Okay? It's very difficult to do if we have confirmation bias. Now, there are multiple times when confirmation bias is going to come into your trading. And let's cover this, and I'm going to show you how you can start to manage confirmation bias. All right? So confirmation bias can come into the markets when we take losses, and then we can just continue to exaggerate and run the story about how bad that loss was, continuing to perpetuate the resentment of that loss, continuing to perpetuate the fear of future losses. So too, you can have confirmation bias to exaggerate and accentuate how good that win was, perpetuating your pride in that moment and perpetuating future greed in the market. And we've talked previously about how fear and greed can impact your ability to stick to your trading plan. So you and I both know how that can negatively impact your ability to getting consistently paid by the market. So that can happen after winning and losing. Confirmation bias can also come in before you take a trade, right? You could be scouting and watching the markets, and you in your mind can create an idea of what you think is going to happen. You can create a belief or an idea or an expectation. I use the word expectation, and really any expectation that you're imposing into the market is unrealistic because nobody knows what's going to happen next in the market. And if we project this expectation onto the market, guess what happens? Because we have such a strong belief, idea, or expectation, through confirmation bias, we only let in information that supports or adds to or builds on our current belief, idea, or expectation. And we block out any information that runs counter to that. So there've probably been many situations where you've been blinded by your bias. It's literally what we call it, blinded by your bias. And you take a trade, you get humbled by the market by a loss, and you ask yourself the question, why on earth did I take that trade? I can see now that I've had my fantasy popped, that was a very low quality setup. What's happening in that moment is you're creating a bias, an idea, an expectation. You're then only letting in information that supports that to reiterate and to exaggerate how good your bias is. And then you're ignoring all the risks and all the drawbacks of that and all the signs that run counter to that. And then you're taking the trade, you're taking a loss, you're getting humbled. And once that belief or that bias is shattered, then you can only see the drawbacks in that moment. Okay? So it's very important to learn to manage confirmation bias not only after you take a loss or a win, but also before you take a trade, so you can objectively view the market and make a wise, rational decision in that moment based on what is the market really communicating to me, and does it align with my trading plan or not? Because if you create a bias or an idea or an expectation before, you can't listen to what the market is trying to communicate to you. You're blocking information out. Okay? And another place that confirmation bias pops up is when you're doing your back testing and you're going in there and you're creating your initial strategy, and you're going in there and you're doing some back testing and you're looking at the market, and maybe you're part of a group or a community and you think that your strategy is the best strategy out there, and you think it's profitable because your mentor and all that are getting good results with it. And then guess what? When you're in the markets doing your back testing, you're going through that back tested data and you're skimming through the market, and you're just trying to find reasons to support why your strategy continues to work and why it's going to be profitable. And you ignore market conditions that may run counter to it. You ignore any risks, you ignore any vulnerabilities of your strategy, you ignore sometimes the drawdowns that your strategy goes through, you ignore that sometimes the strategy doesn't perform well when the market's in certain conditions. And because you're blinded by confirmation bias when you're doing your testing, then you have to learn the hard way when you trade real capital and you put real capital on the line. So that's another place confirmation bias comes in. And there are countless other times as well with your decision making, with your emotions, with any sort of testing or any goals you have. You know, when you set a goal to become a funded trader and you put that up on a pedestal, or you want to become a full-time trader, and then guess what? You have that belief or that idea in your mind of, I want to be a full-time trader, it's the best. And you then go and find supporting evidence to confirm why that belief is, or that idea is correct. And you subconsciously block out or ignore any ideas that run counter to it. Okay, I hope this is starting to make sense, but really confirmation bias is an absolute killer in your trading because it stops you from being objective and making objective, balanced decisions from your prefrontal cortex. It makes things good or bad, greed or fear, and it activates the amygdala. Confirmation bias blocks out half the story, it lowers your awareness, it increases your emotion. It stops you from consistently executing on your trading plan, therefore it stops you from consistent profits from the market. So how do we go in there and break it? Well, after winning and losing in the 12-week program, I teach a process to start becoming aware of the information that was blocked out in that moment. Okay, that's a very important masterclass covered in week 5. There are other things, for example, my free Bulletproof Your Mindset tool. This is a tool that anyone can download, link in the description. I encourage every single one of you to do so. And that tool is going to help you, before you get into a trade, identify these beliefs, ideas, or expectations and ground them so that you can remove confirmation bias in that moment before you're trading. You can objectively see what the market's trying to communicate to you without bias. And if it aligns with your trading plan, you then execute. Bam, that's a great tool that's going to help you increase your decision making, lower your emotions, help you make more money as a trader. Okay? And another one is when you go in and test your strategy and you create your initial strategy, like I've talked about in a few of these previous videos in this YouTube, go in there and ask yourself after you've done the initial testing, go and test again and figure out what are the risks, what are the drawbacks, what are the vulnerabilities of my strategy, and become aware of them in advance and plan and prepare for them, right? Put contingencies in place so you plan and prepare for them so that when these things do come around, you've got a contingency plan. You're going to be much better prepared than anybody else in your community. You're going to sustain periods of trading that other traders in your community won't be able to sustain because they haven't planned and prepared for them. And when you're going for funding and when you're going for a full-time job or a full-time trading path rather, make yourself aware in advance. What are the drawbacks? What are the risks? What are the disadvantages? What are the vulnerabilities of being a full-time funded trader? And then again, plan contingencies and plan risk management protocols to ensure you're prepared for those things. So each of these things that make you aware of the other side help you break confirmation bias, help you become more objective, have more information, have a greater awareness, lower your emotional state, therefore making more objective decisions according to your process and helping you achieve consistent profitability. Okay? If you found this useful or insightful, or you learned something new from it, let me know in the comments. Chuck it a like, share this video with your trading communities. That helps me grow, that helps get this information out there. Make sure you do the trading psychology archetype quiz. That's going to share with you which of the 4 trading mindsets you have, as well as give you a very important document at the end helping you become consistently paid by the markets. All the links of the things I've mentioned are in the description throughout this video. But thank you for watching this video on confirmation bias, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.